The sky over the Dakota prairie didn't just weep that night. It raged. It was a fury of black clouds and slashing rain that could strip a soul bare. In a lone cabin, a young woman believed her world was confined to the fence posts her father had driven into the unforgiving earth. But that night, the storm would bring more than rain. It would bring a man hunted by civilization, a warrior bleeding at her door. She would make a choice that would defy her father, her future, and the most powerful man in the territory, sparking a story of forbidden love, brutal betrayal, and a promise whispered in the dark, a promise that would only be kept in the face of death, before the very eyes of their enemies. The wind was a living thing. It clawed at the sod roof of the small homestead, screaming like a banshee through the cracks in the cottonwood planks. Abigail McGregor, barely 19, pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the single window, watching the world dissolve into a maelstrom of mud and water. Outside, the Dakota territory was being erased. Her father, Ewan McGregor, sat by the hearth, the firelight carving deep lines into his weathered face. He was a man forged in the harsh highlands of Scotland and tempered by the even harsher realities of the American West. He cleaned his rifle with a meticulousness that bordered on prayer, the rhythmic scrape of the cleaning rod, a familiar, comforting sound against the storm's chaos. Not a night for man, nor beast to be out. He grumbled, his voice a low burr. "Pray the stock are holding." Abigail didn't answer. Her prayers were for something less tangible, a reprieve from the suffocating loneliness of their isolated life. They were miles from the nearest settlement of Redemption Creek, a town that was little more than a dusty street and a handful of false-fronted buildings huddled together against the immense, indifferent prairie. Her world was this cabin, the chicken coop, the barn, and the endless horizon that promised everything and offered nothing. A sudden violent crash of lightning illuminated the yard, followed by a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the cabin. In that stark, momentary flash, Abigail saw it, a shape dark and crumpled near the split-rail fence that marked the edge of their meager cornfield. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. Her breath hitched. Father Ewan was on his feet in an instant, the rifle now in his hands, not as a tool, but as a weapon. "What is it, girl? There's someone out there, by the fence." He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. Likely a drifter caught in the squall. Or a fool. Either way, he's not our trouble. But another flash of lightning revealed the figure trying to rise, then collapsing again. Abigail's heart, a thing she'd long thought dormant, lurched with a terrifying pity. "He's hurt, Father. We can't just leave him. We can and we will," Ewan said, his voice hard as iron. "This land is full of men who'd slit our throats for a bag of flour and a dry blanket. You forget the stories about the renegades, the outlaws." And he trailed off, but she knew what he meant. The Indians. To her father, they were a faceless, hostile force the savages whispered about in town, blamed for every missing cow and every spooked horse. He bolted the door. "He's in God's hands now, Abigail." Abigail returned to her small cot, the rough wool blanket, a poor comfort. But she couldn't sleep. The image of the fallen man was seared into her mind. Hours passed. The storm's fury lessened to a miserable steady downpour. Her father's snores filled the small cabin. Driven by an impulse, she didn't understand a rebellion against the fear that had governed her entire life. She rose. She slipped on her worn leather boots and pulled her father's heavy oilskin coat from its peg. Her hands trembled as she slid the bolt on the door, the sound deafening in the quiet. She slipped out into the cold, wet darkness. The mud sucked at her boots. The rain was icy against her face. She found him where she'd last seen him, a heap of soaked buckskin and misery. As she drew closer, her lantern cast a pool of trembling yellow light. He was Native American, his long black hair plastered to his face and neck. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his side, and his breathing was a shallow, ragged affair. His face, even slack with pain, was strong-boned, with a proud, straight nose and a firm jaw. He was young, not much older than her. Fear warred with compassion. Every warning her father had ever given her screamed at her to run back inside, to bolt the door, and forget what she'd seen. The men in Redemption Creek, led by the territory's most influential rancher, Silas Blackwood, spoke of the Lakota with a venomous hatred. They said the warriors were devils on horseback. This man didn't look like a devil. He looked like he was dying. His eyes fluttered open. They were dark, fiercely intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. He tried to push himself up, his hand instinctively going to a knife sheathed at his belt, but a wave of agony contorted his features, and he fell back with a groan. In that moment, Abigail McGregor made a choice that would unravel her world. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I want to help you." She didn't know his name. She didn't know his crime. She only knew that leaving him to die in the mud was a sin her soul could not bear. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she hooked her arms under his half-dragging, half-carrying the feverish, semi-conscious warrior toward the one place she could hide him, the small, musty root cellar hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn. As she struggled with his dead weight, she found a name for the feeling churning in her gut. It wasn't just pity, it was defiance. The root cellar was Abigail's secret place, a cool, dark sanctuary, redolent of damp earth potatoes and preserved apples. A trapdoor in the corner of the barn, usually hidden beneath a stack of empty grain sacks, led down into the small, cramped space. It was here she laid the wounded man on a bed of old blankets, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. By the flickering light of her lantern, she saw the full extent of his injury. It was a bullet wound low on his right side. It was clean, through and through, but it was festering. His skin was hot to the touch, and a fever glaze coated his dark eyes. Panic seized her. She was no healer. Her knowledge was limited to the poultices and herbal remedies her mother had taught her before consumption had stolen her away 5 years prior. But her father was a light sleeper, and taking anything from the main cabin's medicine chest was a risk she couldn't afford. Working quickly, she tore strips from a clean flour sack she kept in the barn for rags. She fetched a bucket of fresh rainwater and with trembling hands began to clean the wound. He winced, a low hiss of pain escaping his lips, but he didn't cry out. His stoicism was unnerving. He watched her every move, his gaze intense, suspicious, yet too weak to protest. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered more to herself than to him. "My name is Abigail." He said nothing, his jaw tight. For the next 2 days, Abigail lived a double life. By day, she was the dutiful daughter performing her chores under her father's watchful eye, forcing down meals she couldn't taste her stomach in knots. Ewan was surly, his mood as foul as the lingering damp from the storm. He spoke of a posse from Redemption Creek that had passed by, led by Silas Blackwood's right-hand man, Caleb Thorne, hunting that renegade Koda Ewan had spat over his morning coffee. The one, they say, led the raid on Blackwood's supply wagon last month. Killed 2 men. Blackwood's put a $500 bounty on his head. Good money. Hope they catch the savage and string him up proper. Abigail's blood ran cold. Koda. Was that his name? The man lying broken in her cellar. The man whose life rested in her hands. she felt a dizzying wave of nausea. She was harboring a wanted murderer, but at night, when her father's snores echoed through the cabin, she became a secret keeper, a conspirator. She would sneak to the barn, carrying stolen food, a piece of bread, a slice of dried meat, and a small tin of her mother's healing salve, a pungent mix of comfrey and yarrow. On the third night, she found him awake and lucid. The fever had broken. He had propped himself up against the earthen wall, his breathing more even. "You are the settler's daughter," he said. His voice was raspy, deeper than she'd imagined, and his English was surprisingly clear, accented, but precise. Abigail nodded, clutching the small parcel of food to her chest. "And you are Koda." His eyes narrowed. "The white men have given me that name on their posters. They say you killed 2 men. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She needed to know. A flicker of something anger-grief passed over his face. "The men who died were my cousins. We were trading furs, not raiding. Blackwood's men ambushed us. They wanted the land our people have hunted for generations, the land where the creek turns to silver." He gestured vaguely to the east. "He wants it for his railroad. He created a crime to justify a war." She looked into his eyes, searching for deceit, for the coldness of a killer. She saw only a profound, burning sense of injustice, and she believed him. Silas Blackwood was a man who exuded a chilling ambition. He was buying up or forcing out every small homesteader in the territory, the McGregor plot being one of the few holdouts. His methods were known to be ruthless. "Why should you believe me?" he asked, his voice rough. "My father. He doesn't trust Mr. Blackwood either," she confessed. "He says a man who smiles that wide is hiding a mouth full of sharp teeth." A faint ghost of a smile touched Koda's lips, then vanished. "Your father is a wise man, but he would give me to them." It was a statement, not a question. Yes, she admitted, her voice small. He would. Over the next week, a strange secret world formed in the cellar. Abigail would bring him food and change his dressing, and he would talk. He told her of his people, the Lakota, not as the savages of her father's tales, but as families. He spoke of his younger sister, of the sacred Black Hills, of the way the stars were a map for the spirits. In turn, she told him of Scotland, a place she'd only known through her father's stories of her mother's garden, and of her own quiet, desperate dreams of seeing an ocean. She found herself lingering longer each night, drawn to his quiet strength, the intelligence in his eyes, and the deep well of dignity he possessed despite his circumstances. He was unlike any man she had ever met. The farmers and ranchers from town were loud coarse, and saw her as little more than a potential wife to cook their meals and bear their children. Koda saw her. He listened. One afternoon, her fragile world nearly shattered. Caleb Thorne rode into their yard unannounced. He was a handsome man, in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with pale eyes that missed nothing. He was Silas Blackwood's enforcer, and he had made his unwelcome intentions toward Abigail clear on more than one occasion. "Afternoon, Ewan. Miss McGregor," he said, tipping his hat, though his eyes were fixed on Abigail. "Just checking on our neighbors. We're still sweeping the area for that murdering savage." "Find any sign?" Ewan asked, leaning on his axe. "He vanished like a damn spirit." "But we will. Mr. Blackwood doesn't tolerate vermin on his land." His gaze swept the property lingering on the barn. "You've got a sturdy barn there. Mind if I take a look inside? Sometimes they burrow into haylofts." Abigail's heart stopped. "There's nothing in there but hay and a few old tools, Mr. Thorne." Still, Caleb insisted, his smile not reaching his eyes. It pays to be thorough. He strode toward the barn. Abigail felt the world tilt on its axis. Every beat of her heart was a drumbeat of doom. This was it. He would find the trapdoor. He would find Koda. They would hang him from the nearest tree, and her life and her father's would be forfeit. Ewan McGregor, ever protective, stepped in front of Caleb. My barn is my own thorn. I've checked it myself. If you're calling me a liar or a sympathizer, you'd best say it plain. There was a tense standoff. Caleb Thorne was a dangerous man, but Ewan, with his calloused hands and unwavering glare, was not a man to be trifled with lightly. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the tall prairie grass. Caleb's thin smile returned. No offense intended, Ewan. Just doing my job. He tipped his hat again, his cold eyes lingering on Abigail one last time. You take care, Miss McGregor. It's a dangerous world for a woman alone. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Abigail leaned against the cabin wall, her legs weak with relief, her hands trembling. She had come so close to disaster. That night, she told Koda what had happened. His wound was healing well, the angry red flesh slowly turning to a healthy pink. He was getting his strength back, and with it a restless energy. I cannot stay, he said, his face grim in the lantern light. I put you and your father in too much danger. Blackwood's man will be back. Where will you go? She asked, her voice thick with a sorrow that surprised her with its intensity. The thought of the cellar being empty, of her nightly visits ending, left a hollow ache in her chest. North, to the hills. There are others there. We will not let him take our land without a fight. He reached out, and for the first time touched her. His fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm, hesitant, and it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. You have a spirit as strong as the winter wind, Abigail McGregor. You showed me kindness when your people showed me only hatred. I will not forget this. His words were a brand on her heart. Be careful, Koda. I will return. He vowed, his voice a low, fierce promise. When Blackwood's shadow is gone from this valley, I will return for you. It was a mad, impossible promise, a dream whispered in a dark cellar. But looking into his earnest eyes, Abigail believed him. She wanted to believe him more than she had ever wanted anything. Their farewell was cut short by a new, more immediate terror. A scratching sound came from the barn door above, followed by the unmistakable creak of her father's heavy boots on the floorboards. Abigail Ewan's voice called out, muffled by the thick wood. What are you doing out here? Panic, cold and absolute washed over her. She'd been so absorbed in her conversation with Koda, she hadn't heard him leave the cabin. She extinguished the lantern, plunging the cellar into total darkness. Just checking on the mere father, she called back, her voice shaking. She seemed restless. At this hour, he sounded suspicious. The footsteps moved closer, directly over the trapdoor. He was standing right on top of it. Abigail held her breath, her hand finding Koda's in the dark. His grip was firm, steadying. Then came the sound of scraping. He was moving the grain sacks. What is this? Ewan's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He had found the trapdoor. The heavy door was thrown open, and the pale moonlight flooded the small space, silhouetting her father's imposing frame. His face was a mask of disbelief, which quickly hardened into a furious betrayal. His eyes fell on Abigail, then on the native warrior beside her, and finally on their clasped hands. What have you done? He roared, the sound echoing in the confined space. You've brought a devil into my home, a wanted murderer. He's not a murderer, Father Abigail pleaded, scrambling to her feet. Blackwood framed him. You have to listen. I'll listen to nothing. Ewan raised the rifle he was carrying, leveling it at Koda's chest. Koda moved with lightning speed, shoving Abigail behind him, shielding her with his own body. He was still weak, but he stood tall, defiant. "Do not harm her," Koda said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "This was my doing. I forced her." "He's lying," Abigail cried, tears streaming down her face. "I helped him. I brought him here." Ewan's face was a torment of rage, fear, and confusion. He loved his daughter more than his own life, but she had betrayed everything he believed in, everything he had taught her to fear. The rifle barrel trembled in his hands. Before he could make a decision, a new sound pierced the night, the thunder of approaching horses. Many of them. Headlights bobbed in the distance, growing closer. "It's Thorn." Koda said, his voice urgent. "Someone must have seen your light. They're coming for me." Ewan's face went pale. If a posse found him harboring the fugitive, they wouldn't just hang Koda. They'd burn the homestead to the ground and likely kill him too. He was trapped between his prejudice and his survival. "Go," Ewan grunted, lowering the rifle just an inch. He gestured with the barrel toward the back of the barn. "There's a loose board behind the stalls. Get out and bring your curse with you. Don't ever let me see you again." It was the only chance they would get. Koda gave Abigail's hand one last, desperate squeeze. He locked eyes with her, 1,000 words passing between them in a silent, searing glance. The promise was still there, burning brighter than ever. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows of the barn. Abigail heard the splintering of the board, and then nothing. Moments later, Caleb Thorne and a dozen armed men stormed into the yard, their lanterns turning the night into a hellish day. "We saw a light in your barn," MacGregor Thorne barked, dismounting. "Have you got something to tell us?" Ewan MacGregor stood at the barn door, his face like a stone mask, his rifle held loosely at his side. "My daughter thought she heard a fox in the chicken coop. We were checking. There's nothing here for you." Thorne's eyes swept over Abigail, noticing her tear-streaked face and disheveled appearance. His lips curled into a sneer. He knew. He couldn't prove it. But he knew. "We'll see about that," he said, pushing past them to search the barn. But Koda was gone. He had vanished back into the night that had delivered him, leaving behind only a broken promise of safety and a new terrifying vow hanging in the air between a settler's daughter and a hunted warrior. The weeks that followed Koda's escape bled into a season of dread. Autumn painted the prairie in hues of gold and rust. But for Abigail, the world had been leached of all color. The silence in the root cellar was a constant aching presence. Her father rarely spoke to her, the chasm of her betrayal standing vast and impassable between them. He worked from sunup to sundown, his body stooped with a new weariness, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and a deep, unspoken fear. The source of that fear had a name, Silas Blackwood. With the renegade Koda gone, Blackwood's power in the territory swelled unchecked. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a king on a throne of prairie dust. He bought the town's sheriff, a weak-willed man named Brodie, and put his own men in positions of authority. Settlers who had once grumbled about Blackwood's land, grabs now fell silent. Fences were moved in the dead of night. Wells were mysteriously fouled. Cattle went missing, only to be found and absorbed into Blackwood's enormous herd. Anyone who protested too loudly found their homestead suffering a sudden tragic fire. The MacGregor farm was an island in Blackwood's ever-expanding ocean, and the tide was rising. Their nearest neighbors, the Jensens, a hard-working Swedish family, packed up and left after their entire winter wheat crop was trampled by a stray herd of longhorns. They sold their land to Blackwood for pennies on the dollar. Caleb Thorne became a constant, unwelcome visitor. He no longer bothered with the pretense of hunting for Koda. His hunt was now for Abigail. He would arrive with gifts, a bolt of calico cloth, a bag of sugar from a distant city that felt more like offerings to a prized mare than tokens of affection. "Mr. Blackwood is a generous man," Caleb would say, his eyes roaming over Abigail in a way that made her skin crawl. "He believes in building a community. He believes in strong families. He worries about you and your father out here, all alone." Ewan would stand by his hand, never far from the axe handle, his face a thundercloud. "We've managed this far on our own. We need no man's charity. It's not charity, Ewan. It's an investment in the future," Caleb would counter, his voice silky smooth. "A man like Silas Blackwood can offer protection, security. He's taken a special interest in your daughter's welfare." One crisp October evening, the threat became an explicit offer. Silas Blackwood himself rode to their homestead, flanked by Caleb and 2 other armed riders. Blackwood was a stark contrast to his rough-hewn enforcer. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored black coat and polished boots, a silver-handled pistol at his hip, more for decoration than use. He had a politician's smile and the dead, predatory eyes of a snake. He dismounted and approached Abigail, who was tending to her mother's small, withered garden. "Miss McGregor," he began, his voice a low purr, "your beauty is wasted on this harsh land. A flower like you should be cultivated in a proper home, not left to the wind and dust." "My home is here, mister," Blackwood Abigail said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "For now," he said, smiling, "but I am a man who builds things. I am building a future here. A rail spur is coming through this valley, and it will make Redemption Creek the jewel of the territory. I want you to be a part of that. As my wife." The proposition hung in the air, as shocking and violent as a gunshot. Abigail stared at him, speechless. Ewan came striding out of the cabin, his face pale with rage. "Get off my land, Blackwood." Blackwood ignored him, his eyes still locked on Abigail. "Your father is a proud man, but pride doesn't fill a barn or protect a daughter from the dangers of this world. The bounty on Koda is still active. There are whispers that he was seen near this very plot of land. It would be a tragedy if the law came to believe your father was a sympathizer. A man can lose everything for a lesser crime. It was a perfectly veiled threat." He knew. He knew everything. Caleb had likely told him of his suspicions from that night. Now he was using it as a weapon. "Marry me," he was saying, "or I will destroy you both. Think on my offer, Miss McGregor," Blackwood said, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "I am holding a Founders' Day celebration in Redemption Creek in 2 weeks' time. A celebration of the new prosperity I have brought to this territory. I expect to announce our engagement then. I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits." As they rode away, Abigail felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Koda's promise to return felt like a child's fantasy. He was one man against Blackwood's empire. He was likely dead or 100 miles away. Hope was a dangerous luxury she could no longer afford. Her father finally broke the silence, his voice raspy with defeat. "We should have left when the Jensens did." "We'll never leave Abigail," said a spark of her old defiance, flaring. "This was Mother's home, and it will be your grave if you defy him," Ewan snapped, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a desperate anguish. "Do you not see the checkmate, girl? He has us. He has offered you a cage of gold and silk, and the alternative is a noose or a pauper's grave. What choice do we have?" Abigail looked out at the vast, empty horizon that had once seemed a prison and now felt like the last bastion of her freedom. She had sheltered a hunted warrior, and in doing so had invited a tyrant to her door. The cage was closing, and the only man who had ever vowed to save her was a ghost. Far from the creeping tyranny in Redemption Creek, in the jagged, wind-scoured labyrinth of the Badlands, a legend was being born. They called him Wanagi the Ghost, a whisper among frustrated posses and terrified railroad survey crews, a rumor in the Lakota camps that were being pushed further and further into the inhospitable wastes. The ghost was Koda. After fleeing the McGregor farm, he had not run north to hide. He had run to fight. The bullet wound in his side was a constant burning reminder of Blackwood's treachery. The memory of Abigail's terrified, defiant face was the fuel that stoked his cold rage into a righteous fire. He would not let Blackwood win. He would not let his promise to her become a lie. He found the scattered remnants of his own band and others' families displaced by Blackwood's relentless expansion. They were hungry, demoralized, and on the verge of starvation. But in Koda, they saw not a defeated fugitive, but a leader. He didn't speak of surrender. He spoke of justice. His war was not one of open battle, which he knew would be suicide. It was a war of whispers and shadows. He and a small band of warriors, young men, as wronged and as furious as himself, began to systematically dismantle Blackwood's operations from the inside out. They would strike at night. A shipment of blasting powder for the railroad would vanish from a guarded wagon. A survey team's meticulously placed markers would be moved, sending their path into an impassable canyon and costing Blackwood weeks of delays. A herd of prize horses, destined for Blackwood's ranch, would be spirited away, not stolen, but set free to run wild in the hills. Koda's greatest weapon was not his knife or his bow, but his mind. He had learned English well from a missionary in his youth, and he understood how the white men thought. He knew their obsession with paper and ledgers. He orchestrated a daring raid on a remote supply depot, not for the guns or the food, but for a single leather-bound book, the paymaster's ledger. In its pages, written in neat cursive, was the proof he needed. Payments to men for land clearance on dates that corresponded with fires at local homesteads. Bonuses awarded to Caleb Thorne for Indian negotiations on the very day of the ambush that had killed his cousins. And most damning of all, a series of large, unexplained payments to Sheriff Brody. He had the truth. But the truth was useless without the power to wield it. His small band of warriors could harass Blackwood, but they couldn't march into Redemption Creek and depose a king. He needed the people to see Blackwood not as a founder, but as a thief. One of his warriors, a young man named Chayton Falcon, brought him news from a sympathetic half-breed trapper who moved between both worlds. Blackwood is holding a great celebration, Chayton reported, as they sat around a smokeless fire in a hidden ravine. He calls it Founders' Day. He will announce that he is taking a wife. Koda's blood ran cold. Who the settler's daughter, Chayton, said his eyes full of pity for his friend. The one with hair the color of corn silk. The one who sheltered you. Her name is Abigail McGregor. The world narrowed to a single point of incandescent rage. Blackwood was not just taking his land. He was taking the one thing that had given him hope in the darkness. He was stealing his future, claiming the woman Koda had vowed to return to. The celebration was not just a display of power. It was a public execution of Koda's promise. He looked at the faces of the men around him. They were weary, their ribs showing through their buckskin shirts, but their eyes held a new fire, a fire he had ignited. He had taught them to fight smart to be ghosts. Now he would ask them to be something more. He plans to claim his queen in front of his subjects, Koda said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He believes we are scattered and broken. He believes we are afraid. He wants to show the people that he is invincible, that his power is absolute. He stood up, the captured ledger in his hand. We will go to his celebration, but we will not go as ghosts. We will go as the truth. We will show the people of that town who their king truly is. We will give them a choice to live on their knees under a tyrant, or to stand with us for the land that belongs to all of us. He looked to the east toward the distant valley where Abigail was trapped. He could almost feel her despair, a cold weight on his own heart. I made a promise, he said more to himself than to his men. I will not break it. The ghost of the Badlands was about to walk into the light. Founder's Day dawned bright and mercilessly clear over Redemption Creek. The town had been transformed. Red, white, and blue bunting was draped over every storefront, flapping listlessly in the dry breeze. Silas Blackwood had spared no expense. Long trestle tables laden with roasted pigs and barrels of whiskey lined the dusty main street. He was buying the loyalty of the townspeople with free food and liquor. For Abigail, it felt like a funeral. She stood in her small room, wearing the dress Blackwood had sent for her. It was a deep blue silk, a garment more luxurious than anything she had ever owned, and it felt like a shroud. Her father had argued, pleaded, and finally resigned himself to the inevitable. He sat in the main room of their cabin, his shoulders slumped in defeat, an old man broken by a world he no longer understood. Caleb Thorne arrived in a polished black buggy to escort her. His usual sneer had been replaced by a proprietary smirk. He looked at her in the blue dress, his eyes glowing with a triumphant possessiveness that made her stomach turn. "Mr. Blackwood will be very pleased," he said, offering his arm. "Today you become the first lady of this territory, Abigail." The ride to town was a blur of misery. Every face she saw was celebrating her damnation. They smiled and waved, toasting the man who was strangling them, oblivious or too scared to care. She saw Sheriff Brody, his face flushed with whiskey, laughing alongside men he knew were criminals. She saw the empty storefront that had belonged to the Jensens. She saw a world remade in Blackwood's image. The ceremony was to take place on a hastily built wooden platform in front of the saloon. Silas Blackwood stood there, beaming, accepting the false adulation of the crowd. He was dressed like a riverboat gambler, all black, silk and silver embroidery. When he saw Abigail approaching on Caleb's arm, his smile widened. He descended the steps to meet her, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. The crowd cheered. "My dear," he murmured, his voice, "for her alone, you look exquisite. A perfect queen for the kingdom I am building." He led her up the steps of the platform. Her legs felt like lead. She looked out at the sea of faces, searching for 1 ounce of sympathy, 1 flicker of defiance, and found none. Her father stood at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen, looking utterly helpless. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. Blackwood raised his hands for silence. "Friends, neighbors, today, we celebrate not just the founding of this town, but its glorious future. A future of prosperity, of progress, brought by the railroad, by industry, by strength." The crowd roared its approval. To secure that future, we must have stability. We must have strong foundations. And the strongest foundation of all is family. He turned to Abigail, taking both her hands in his. His grip was like iron. "And so it is my profound honor and pleasure to announce my intention to unite my future with that of this territory's finest flower, Miss Abigail McGregor." More cheers, a few drunken whoops. Abigail closed her eyes, bracing herself for the final damning words. This was it. The cage was slamming shut. And then a new sound cut through the celebration. It started at the north end of town, a low rhythmic beat, the sound of a single drum. The crowd stirred, turning to look. The cheering faltered. The drumming grew louder, closer. It was joined by a voice, then another and another, rising in a low, powerful chant. It was a Lakota war song. A lone rider appeared at the end of the street. Then 2, then 10, then 20. They were not clad in the brilliant feathers and paint of a war party, but in simple buckskin. They were lean, hard-faced men, and they moved with a silent, unified purpose. At their head rode Koda. He sat atop a proud black stallion, his long hair blowing in the wind. He was no longer the wounded fugitive from her cellar. He was a leader, his face set like granite, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to set the very air around him alight. He carried no rifle, only a sheathed knife at his belt and a leather-bound book held in his hand. The crowd gasped, stumbling back, creating a wide-open path down the center of the street. Blackwood's men, taken completely by surprise, fumbled for their pistols. Sheriff Brody's face went white as a sheet. Silas Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. "Koda," he hissed, "how dare you show your face here? Seize him. He's a wanted murderer." Caleb Thorne drew his pistol, but before he could aim, Koda's warriors had fanned out their own bows and rifles, appearing as if from nowhere. They didn't make a move to attack. They simply stood a silent, menacing line between the townspeople and Blackwood's platform. They were outnumbered, but their discipline and presence was so absolute that no one dared move. Koda rode his horse slowly, deliberately down the lane of stunned townsfolk, the drumbeat marking his progress. He never took his eyes off Abigail. In his gaze, she saw everything: the memory of the storm, the promise in the cellar, the fury at her captivity, and a love so fierce it was a physical force. The despair that had crushed her spirit moments before evaporated, replaced by a wild, soaring hope. He stopped his horse directly in front of the platform, looking up at her, past the sputtering, enraged form of Silas Blackwood. "I told you I would return. Abigail McGregor." Koda's voice rang out clear and strong for all to hear. "I have come to keep my promise." He looked from her to Blackwood, his expression one of pure contempt. "You will not have her, and you will not have this land." He held up the ledger. "And your reign as king is over." For a long, drawn-out moment, the entire town of Redemption Creek was frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The festive air had curdled the scent of roasting meat and whiskey, suddenly seeming cheap and suffocating. The standoff was absolute. Koda and his silent, resolute warriors on one side, their presence radiating a calm, dangerous energy that belied their numbers. On the other, Silas Blackwood and his hired guns, their bravado evaporating like morning mist, revealing the brittle fear beneath. Caught between these two forces were the townspeople, their faces a gallery of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrible understanding. Lies and savage tricks, Blackwood finally bellowed his voice, a fraction too high, as he fought to regain control of a scene that had spun completely out of his grasp. He gestured wildly at Koda, turning his politician's smile, now a ghastly, strained thing, back upon the crowd. "This is the murderer who raided my supply wagons, a renegade with a price on his head. Will you stand by and let this heathen dictate terms to us, to me?" The man who built this town from dust, Koda, showed no reaction to the outburst. With a grace that was almost hypnotic, he swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and economical. He walked forward, the dust puffing around his moccasins, and tossed the leather-bound ledger onto the platform. It landed with a soft, definitive thud at Blackwood's polished boots. "That is your paymaster's ledger." Blackwood Koda's voice rang out, not loud, but carrying a weight that cut through the nervous murmurs. "The one from your depot at Stony Creek. It tells a different story than yours." He turned his piercing gaze from Blackwood and let it sweep across the crowd, settling on a weathered farmer near the front. "Mr. Abernathy, you lost your best bull last spring. Look on page 27. You'll find a payment to 2 of Thorn's men for livestock acquisition on that very day." Abernathy's jaw went slack. Beside him, a woman gasped. "Open it!" Blackwood Koda commanded, his voice hardening. "Read to your people the names of the men you paid to burn out the Jensens. Read to them the bonus you paid Caleb Thorne for ambushing my cousins, who came to you under a flag of trade, not war." Caleb Thorne, his face the color of spoiled milk, took a half-step back. The crowd's murmuring intensified, shifting from confusion to a low, angry growl. They all remembered the Jensen's fire, the convenient tragedy that had cleared the way for Blackwood's grazing land. They remembered Abernathy's loss. These were not abstract accusations. They were wounds in the town's own memory, now reopened and laid bare. Koda's gaze found Sheriff Brody, who was trying to shrink behind one of the platform's support posts. "Sheriff, the ledger also shows monthly payments to you for civic cooperation." Tell the people what that means. Does it mean ignoring the brand on a stolen horse? Does it mean losing paperwork when a homesteader files a complaint? Tell them how this man's silver bought your silence. Brody's face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting from the hard faces of Koda's warriors to the ledger, and then to the increasingly hostile faces in the crowd he was sworn to protect. The whiskey courage had utterly abandoned him, leaving only the sour, gut-wrenching taste of his own cowardice. "That's enough." Caleb Thorne finally snarled, his composure shredding completely. The terror of exposure propelled him to action. He ripped his pistol from its holster, the metallic rasp, deafeningly loud in the tense silence. He leveled it squarely at Koda's chest. "I'll send you to hell myself, you red-skinned liar." The crowd recoiled with a collective scream, but before Thorne's finger could tighten on the trigger, another shot cracked through the air, a deep, familiar boom of a hunting rifle. It didn't come from the warriors. It came from the edge of the crowd, from the shadows of the blacksmith's awning. Caleb grunted a sound of pained surprise, and his pistol clattered to the wooden planks. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, where a crimson flower was already blooming on his white shirt. Every head swiveled to the source of the shot. Ewan McGregor stood there, his old rifle still smoking his face, a mask of grim, righteous determination. He had watched his daughter stand on that platform, a sacrifice to a monster. He had heard the truth in Koda's words, a truth his own heart had suspected, but his fear had refused to acknowledge. In that one explosive moment, he had shed his prejudice and his fear and chosen his daughter. He had chosen what was right. "My family has seen enough of you." Thorne Ewan growled the words, carrying across the stunned street. That single stunning act of defiance shattered Blackwood's illusion of absolute control. The dam of fear that had held the town in check for months finally broke. "My fence," a farmer shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Blackwood. "You paid men to move it in the night." Another man, whose brother had been forced to sell his land for a pittance, surged forward, his fists clenched. The angry murmurs erupted into a unified wave of outrage. Seeing his kingdom of lies crumbling into dust, Blackwood made a last, desperate move born of pure panic. The mask of the civilized benefactor was gone, revealing the cornered rat beneath. He lunged for Abigail, yanking her in front of him as a shield. He pressed the cold, ornate barrel of his silver-handled pistol to her temple. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice a shrill, cracking parody of his former authority. "All of you, or she dies." The crowd gasped, stumbling back. But Koda was already in motion. He launched himself onto the platform in a single fluid bound. He didn't look at the gun. He looked only at Abigail, his eyes locking with hers, conveying a simple, absolute message that cut through her terror. "Trust me. I am here. Let her go." "Blackwood Koda," said his voice, dropping to a deadly calm. "It is over. It's over when I say it is." Blackwood shrieked, dragging Abigail toward the back of the platform, his eyes wild with the terror of a king about to be deposed. In that moment of violent chaos, a cold clarity descended upon Abigail. The fear was still there, a block of ice in her stomach, but it no longer controlled her. Koda's presence, his impossible return, had ignited the spark of defiance she had nurtured in secret. She was not a prize to be won or a shield to be used. Remembering the quiet, wounded warrior who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, she drove the heel of her boot down hard on Blackwood's polished instep. He roared in pain, his grip on her arm loosening for a fraction of a second as his focus shattered. It was all the time Koda needed. He crossed the platform in 2 long, silent strides. He didn't bother with the gun. His hand shot out like a striking snake, seizing Blackwood's wrist. With a swift, brutal twist, he snapped the bone. Blackwood screamed a high, thin sound of agony, and the pistol fired harmlessly into the sky. Koda's other hand slammed into his chest, not a punch, but a powerful shove that sent the once powerful man sprawling in a pathetic, whimpering heap on the stage of his own triumph. The reckoning was complete. It had happened not in the shadows or by rumor, but in the bright, unforgiving light of day, before the very eyes of everyone Blackwood had sought to rule. As a newly emboldened Sheriff Brodie and his deputies moved in to haul the sobbing Blackwood and the groaning Caleb Thorne away, a profound quiet fell over the street. Koda turned to Abigail. The chaos of the crowd, the silent warriors, the dazed townspeople, it all faded into a muted roar. In the center of the world, there was only the 2 of them standing on the debris of a tyrant's ambition. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I broke my promise to your father," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "He told me never to let him see me again." Abigail's gaze drifted to her father. Ewan was slowly approaching the platform, his rifle now held loosely at his side. His face was a complex landscape of relief, regret, and a hard-won, grudging respect. He looked at Koda, and for the first time he saw not a savage, not a renegade, but the man who had honored his daughter when he himself had been prepared to sacrifice her. He gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of peace, of acceptance, of thanks. Abigail turned back to Koda, her heart so full of a fierce, soaring joy she thought it might burst. "You kept the one that mattered," she whispered. There on the platform, built for a tyrant's coronation, with the silent town and the open sky, as their witnesses, Koda took her hands in his. The warrior who had been a ghost, the leader who had brought justice, now spoke a new vow, not in a whisper as he had in the dark cellar, but for all the world to hear. "Abigail McGregor," he said, his voice ringing with honor and a deep, abiding love that had weathered storms and defied empires. "Will you be my wife?" A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a ripple of stunned silence, and then slowly a spattering of applause. It was a sound of healing, of 2 worlds finding an impossible bridge, and before the eyes of their former enemies and their new allies, the settler's daughter gave her answer to the warrior who had returned for her, their 2 lives joining not in violence or conquest, but in a promise that had against all odds been kept. And so the story of Abigail McGregor and the warrior Koda became a whisper on the prairie winds, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, courage can bloom in the most unlikely of hearts. Theirs was a love that refused to be defined by fences or fear a promise that crossed the divide of 2 cultures and proved stronger than the tyranny of a false king. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about how much land you can conquer, but how fiercely you will fight to protect what you love. If their story of courage and love against all odds moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this video with someone who loves a timeless tale of the Old West. Most importantly, if you want to hear more stories like this, filled with history, heart, and drama, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for listening.